In the grand theater of galactic civilization, where species measured their worth in conquered worlds and subjugated populations, the Universal Species Classification Index stood as the ultimate arbitrator of cosmic importance. This bureaucratic marvel, maintained by the Galactic Administrative Consortium with all the enthusiasm of a particularly pedantic librarian, categorized every known sentient species across a delightfully complicated spectrum of threat levels, technological advancement, and what the manual euphemistically termed conquest potential. The classification system operated on a beautifully simple premise that would make any middle manager weep with joy. Everyone had their place, and that place was determined by how efficiently they could eliminate everyone else. Class I species occupied the bottom rung, blessed with the evolutionary gifts of photosynthesis and an alarming tendency toward pacifism. Class X species dominated the upper echelons, distinguished by their remarkable ability to turn neighboring star systems into decorative asteroid fields with minimal effort and maximum style. At the very pinnacle of this cosmic food chain, basking in the warm glow of their own superiority like particularly smug lizards on a heating rock, sat the Krethak Empire. These magnificent specimens of evolutionary excess had spent the better part of 3 millennia proving that nature's greatest joke was giving a species both opposable thumbs and an complete absence of chill. Standing nearly 3 meters tall when fully extended, the Krethak possessed the charming combination of chitinous exoskeletons that could deflect plasma rounds and a collection of razor-sharp appendages that made Swiss Army knives look woefully under-equipped. Their homeworld a delightful paradise where the ambient radiation could sterilize lesser species at 50 kilometers, and the native flora considered sulfuric acid a light seasoning, had produced a race of beings who viewed the concept of environmental hazard as a quaint suggestion rather than a legitimate concern. The Krethak breathing apparatus could process atmospheric compositions that would send most species into immediate respiratory failure, while their redundant organ systems meant that losing a heart or two during combat was merely an inconvenience rather than a career-ending injury. Technologically speaking, the Krethak had achieved that perfect balance between devastating efficiency and artistic flair that marked truly advanced civilization. Their warships resembled enormous beetles crossed with weapons platforms, bristling with enough firepower to crack planetary crusts, while maintaining the aesthetic sensibilities of beings who understood that intimidation was half the battle. Their signature weapon, the molecular disruptor cannon, didn't simply destroy enemy vessels so much as suggest very firmly that their constituent atoms might prefer to explore alternative career opportunities in different spatial configurations. The bureaucratic machinery of the Krethak Empire operated with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled torture device. Their Department of Conquest classification maintained detailed files on every known species, complete with threat assessments, recommended subjugation protocols and helpful suggestions for post-conquest resource extraction. The filing system alone was a masterpiece of organizational intimidation, with color-coded threat levels ranging from laughably harmless to might require actual effort to crush. Lesser species were processed through this system with all the personal attention typically reserved for insurance claims. The Vrelian Hive Collective, despite their impressive population of 40 billion drones, rated a mere Class IV designation due to their unfortunate tendency to surrender when faced with anything more threatening than a strongly worded diplomatic note. The silicon-based Crystalline Confederacy achieved Class V status primarily because their rocky biology made them slightly more challenging to incinerate than traditional carbon-based life forms. The Krethak's conquest record read like a particularly violent travel brochure. 17 star systems had fallen before their advance, each campaign meticulously documented in reports that managed to make genocide sound like routine maintenance. The Aldorian Republic had required exactly 47 standard hours to transition from sovereign nation to historical footnote. The methane breathers of Titan VII had lasted somewhat longer, mainly because it took extra time to locate atmospheric processing equipment, capable of replacing their native gases with something more palatable to Krethak sensibility. What made the Krethak truly special wasn't just their capacity for violence, though they excelled in that department with the dedication of artists pursuing their craft. It was their absolute certainty in their own superiority, a confidence so complete and unshakable that it had achieved the status of natural law. They didn't conquer worlds so much as correct cosmic errors, bringing proper order to star systems that had been operating under the misguided assumption that they possessed independent sovereignty. This supremely confident worldview received an interesting challenge when their long-range reconnaissance probes detected something unusual in the Outer Rim territories. A previously uncharted system containing 9 planets, with particular interest focusing on the third world from the star. The initial data streams painted a picture of a blue-green marble populated by what appeared to be a relatively young bipedal species that had barely managed to achieve primitive spaceflight. The discovery triggered the standard bureaucratic protocols with mechanical precision. Forms were filed, threat assessments were initiated, and conquest planning committees began their preliminary discussions about resource allocation and timeline projection. According to every metric in their comprehensive database, this new species appeared to represent exactly the sort of low-hanging fruit that made for efficient expansion campaigns. After all, what possible challenge could a single world of primitives pose to the undisputed masters of the galaxy? The Krethak First Contact Fleet materialized at the edge of the Sol system, with all the subtle grace of a volcanic eruption in a library. 37 vessels of varying sizes and intimidation factors dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the sort of ominous black finish that suggested both advanced metallurgy and a concerning enthusiasm for dramatic entrance. The fleet's arrival should have triggered immediate panic across every communication channel on the primitive world ahead, followed by the traditional sequence of desperate surrender negotiations that made conquest such a predictable pleasure. Instead, the first response from the blue planet came in the form of what appeared to be a mathematics lesson. The transmission bounced off several orbital relay stations with amateur-hour encryption, contained a series of prime numbers followed by what the translation matrix tentatively identified as greetings, in approximately 47 different linguistic variants. The communications officer, a seasoned veteran of 16 successful intimidation campaigns, stared at his displays with the expression of someone who had just been handed a puzzle box while expecting a surrender document. The fleet commander, whose personal collection of conquered world trophies occupied an entire wall of his private quarters, reviewed the initial data with growing bewilderment. The target species had apparently detected their arrival despite employing stealth technology that rendered them invisible to most Class-XII civilizations. More puzzling still, the response suggested these primitives had somehow anticipated first contact protocols and prepared accordingly. The translation algorithm struggled with concepts that seemed to shift meaning depending on context, producing delightfully unhelpful phrases like "welcome to the neighborhood" and "we come in peace, please don't shoot." Standard intimidation broadcasts commenced according to established protocol. The message, refined through centuries of successful psychological warfare, began with a comprehensive listing of the Krethak Empire's military capabilities, followed by detailed descriptions of what happened to species who chose resistance over cooperation. The audio transmission employed subsonic frequencies, specifically designed to trigger fear responses in carbon-based nervous systems, while the visual component featured artistic montages of previous conquest victory. The human response arrived approximately 18 minutes later, which fell well within acceptable parameters for primitive communication systems processing existential threats. However, the content proved somewhat unexpected. Instead of the traditional mixture of terror and desperate negotiation attempts, the transmission appeared to contain what the linguistic analysis computers identified as humor. The message included references to little green men, expressions of disappointment about the lack of anal probes, and a cheerful invitation to talk this over like civilized beings. The communications officer submitted a formal request for clarification of translation protocols, suspecting equipment malfunction. The idea that a species facing imminent conquest would respond with jokes fell so far outside established behavioral models that it triggered automatic error-checking routine. The Cultural Analysis Department ran triple verification scans, convinced their systems had somehow confused comedy broadcasts with official government responses. Further communications revealed additional anomalies that began testing the boundaries of established xenopsychology. The humans demonstrated an alarming tendency to respond to threats with what they termed counter-threats, that made no logical sense within conventional military doctrine. Promises of orbital bombardment were met with detailed descriptions of something called nuclear winter, that these primitives claimed to have already survived multiple times through voluntary simulation exercises. The fleet's psychological warfare specialist, a consummate professional, whose previous assignments had included breaking the will of 3 different hive mind species, found himself confronting responses that violated every principle of rational behavior. Humans appeared to interpret descriptions of their impending subjugation as opportunities for what they called negotiation, treating the Krethak Empire's non-negotiable demands as opening positions in some sort of diplomatic auction. Most disturbing of all was the humans' apparent lack of proper respect for established galactic hierarchies. They insisted on treating the Krethak representatives as equals, asking questions about their culture, expressing curiosity about their homeworld's environmental conditions, and making social observations that suggested these primitives viewed first contact as a learning opportunity rather than a surrender ceremony. The cultural exchange protocols kept malfunctioning as humans provided unrequested information about their own civilization, with the enthusiasm of tourists describing vacation destinations. The technical analysis teams reported additional complications that transformed routine conquest preparations into bureaucratic nightmares. Human technology appeared to operate on principles that violated several established scientific constants. Their primitive spacecraft exhibited performance characteristics that shouldn't have been possible given their apparent technological limitations, while their communication systems demonstrated encryption capabilities that suggested mathematical sophistication well beyond their supposed developmental stage. Perhaps most unnervingly, the humans began asking questions about Krethak physiology with the sort of clinical curiosity typically reserved for scientific research. They wanted to know about atmospheric requirements, nutritional needs, reproduction cycles, and social structure. The intelligence officers interpreting these inquiries couldn't determine whether this represented genuine academic interest or extremely sophisticated information gathering for military purpose. The conquest timeline, originally projected at 72 hours from initial contact to complete planetary subjugation, began experiencing what the planning department diplomatically termed scope creep. Every attempted escalation met with human responses that seemed designed to transform military conquest into diplomatic process. Ultimatums became discussion points, threats became cultural exchange opportunities, and the entire established framework of intimidation-based subjugation started resembling something uncomfortably close to actual conversation. The fleet commander found himself in the unprecedented position of requesting guidance from higher command regarding species that refused to behave according to established patterns. His reports, carefully worded to avoid suggesting incompetence, described a target civilization that appeared to be operating under completely different assumptions about how first contact scenarios were supposed to proceed. The humans, meanwhile, continued transmitting messages that grew increasingly friendly and welcoming with each exchange. They expressed excitement about meeting new neighbors, offered to share cultural artifacts and scientific discoveries, and began making preparations for what they enthusiastically described as the greatest moment in human history. Their genuine enthusiasm for interspecies contact suggested either complete ignorance of their situation or a level of confidence that bordered on the delusion. As the standoff entered its second standard day, with human responses growing more cordial and Krethak confusion deepening by the hour, one uncomfortable possibility began emerging from the intelligence analysis. These primitives weren't behaving like a species facing conquest, because they didn't seem to recognize that conquest was actually on the table. The question that began haunting the command staff was simple, terrifying, and completely outside their experience. What exactly did these humans think was happening here? The answer to that question arrived in a data package that would have been hilarious if it hadn't been so thoroughly devastating to every assumption the Krethak had ever made about galactic civilization. The humans, in their characteristically helpful manner, had compiled what they cheerfully described as a cultural orientation packet, designed to facilitate mutual understanding between their species. The intelligence analysis team approached this gift with the sort of careful optimism typically reserved for suspicious packages ticking at irregular intervals. The first section contained what humans termed recreational activities, presented with the same casual enthusiasm most species reserved for describing particularly pleasant weather patterns. The Krethak cultural specialists found themselves staring at documentation of beings who voluntarily threw themselves out of perfectly functional aircraft for entertainment, deliberately descended into underground cave systems that could collapse at any moment, and engaged in something called extreme sports, that appeared to involve adding unnecessary danger to otherwise manageable activities. The mountain climbing documentation proved particularly educational. Humans routinely ascended vertical rock faces in conditions that would challenge Krethak military equipment, carrying minimal supplies and apparently motivated by nothing more than the desire to reach the top and then come back down again. The casualty statistics, presented with the sort of cheerful acceptance most species reserved for minor inconveniences, suggested that these primitives considered a 20% fatality rate an acceptable cost for weekend entertainment. The underwater exploration files revealed beings who descended to crushing depths in metal containers barely adequate for the task, seeking out environments where equipment failure meant instant death and rescue was functionally impossible. They called this fun and documented their adventures with the enthusiasm of beings describing successful farming techniques. The deep-sea pressure ratings alone indicated physiological capabilities that exceeded most military specifications. Perhaps most disturbing was the humans' relationship with their own planet's biological hazards. Earth, according to their own cheerfully detailed documentation, hosted an impressive collection of organisms, apparently designed by a deity with serious anger management issues. Venomous creatures occupied every available ecological niche. Predatory species roamed both land and sea with remarkable efficiency, and the plant life included specimens capable of delivering toxins that could incapacitate beings through casual contact. The humans' response to sharing their world with these biological weapons was to classify them as wildlife and develop tourism industries around observing them in their natural habitat. They swam with apex predators, hiked through territories occupied by large carnivores, and cultivated gardens containing plants that could kill unwary visitors through inadvertent consumption. The concept of treating lethal organisms as scenic attractions fell so far outside established behavioral norms that the xenopsychology department requested additional computational resources to process the implication. The revelation that fundamentally transformed the entire encounter came buried in a subsection of geological data that the humans had included apparently as background information. Earth carried a planetary classification that the Krethak databases had somehow overlooked during initial analysis. Class-XII, a designation reserved for celestial bodies where the environmental conditions were so aggressively hostile that they served as natural selection pressure cookers for any species unfortunate enough to evolve there. Class-XII worlds were theoretical constructs in most galactic databases, representing environments so lethal that they functioned as natural weapons testing facilities for evolutionary development. The surface conditions included atmospheric compositions that were barely breathable by most standards, temperature variations that could flash freeze or incinerate unprepared organisms, and geological activity that regularly reshaped entire continents without advance notice. Weather patterns on such worlds routinely generated forces equivalent to planetary bombardment, delivered with the casual regularity of seasonal change. The biological survey data revealed the true scope of human capabilities with the sort of clinical precision that made comfortable assumptions crumble into dust. Human physiology represented millions of years of evolutionary refinement under conditions that would serve as execution methods for most galactic species. Their cardiovascular systems could maintain function under gravitational stresses that would liquefy Krethak organs, while their skeletal structure could absorb impact forces that exceeded military armor specifications. The human immune system constituted a biological weapons platform capable of adapting to novel threats in real time, treating alien pathogens as interesting puzzles rather than existential challenges. Their nervous system operated under stress conditions that would induce permanent psychological damage in beings adapted to more civilized environments, while their pain tolerance thresholds suggested either remarkable resilience or a concerning disconnection from basic survival instincts. Most unnervingly, the humans had thrived in this environment. They hadn't merely survived their hostile homeworld. They had developed complex civilizations, advanced technologies, and sophisticated cultural systems, while simultaneously engaged in an ongoing battle for survival against a planet apparently determined to kill them through creative environmental hazard diplomacy. Their technological development had occurred under pressure conditions that would have crushed most species during their primitive phases. The military analysis department began generating reports that transformed routine conquest projections into academic exercises in theoretical impossibility. Human physical capabilities,
when properly understood within the context of their environmental conditioning, suggested beings who could function as living weapons platforms without requiring additional equipment. Their psychological profiles indicated individuals who treated life-threatening situations as normal operational parameters, approaching danger with the sort of casual competence that marked genuinely dangerous predators. The cultural anthropology teams uncovered additional complications that elevated human civilization from primitive target to significant strategic concern. These beings had developed multiple independent approaches to warfare, refined through thousands of years of continuous practice against both environmental hazards and each other. Their military history read like a comprehensive manual for creative violence, featuring innovations that demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in the application of destructive force. The humans' approach to technological development revealed particularly troubling patterns. They had apparently solved engineering challenges by incorporating design philosophies that embraced rather than avoided dangerous operational parameters. Their space program, according to the technical specifications, involved strapping themselves to controlled explosions and riding the resulting forces beyond their atmosphere with the sort of confident enthusiasm most species reserved for proven technology. The reconnaissance teams reviewing human technological capabilities discovered systems that operated according to principles the Krethak had dismissed as theoretical impossibility. Human spacecraft achieved performance characteristics through approaches that suggested either complete ignorance of established safety protocols or a fundamental comfort level with risk factors that exceeded military specifications. Their communication networks demonstrated redundancy planning that indicated preparation for conflict scenarios involving planetary-scale infrastructure destruction. The intelligence synthesis reports painted a picture that transformed the entire strategic situation from routine conquest to potential diplomatic crisis. Earth wasn't a primitive world populated by convenient targets for subjugation. It was a Class-XII Deathworld that had produced a species of apex predators who had achieved technological civilization while simultaneously maintaining their environmental adaptations to one of the most hostile planets in the known galaxy. The uncomfortable reality settling over the Krethak fleet was that they might not be the most dangerous beings in this particular encounter. The humans' cheerful friendliness and genuine enthusiasm for first contact weren't signs of primitive naivety. They were the behavioral patterns of confident predators who didn't feel threatened because they weren't threatened. The question that began reshaping every operational assumption was elegantly simple. If humans were this dangerous accidentally, what were they like when they were trying? The answer to that existentially uncomfortable question materialized approximately 47 minutes after the Krethak intelligence teams finished their comprehensive threat reassessment. The humans, maintaining their pattern of helpful communication, transmitted what they described as a technological demonstration designed to showcase their defensive capabilities in the spirit of mutual transparency. The fleet's sensor arrays detected massive energy signatures emerging from the planet's surface, with the sort of casual efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first rodeo with potentially hostile alien visitors. What followed challenged every assumption about primitive civilizations that the Krethak had spent millennia perfecting. A collection of vessels emerged from Earth's atmosphere that defied comfortable categorization as either spacecraft or weapons platform. The human ships possessed the sort of clean, functional aesthetic that marked truly advanced engineering, while their performance characteristics suggested propulsion systems that operated on principles the Krethak databases classified as theoretically possible but practically inadvisable. The fleet's tactical analysis computers experienced what could generously be described as philosophical crises as they attempted to process human military technology. The vessels approaching their position appeared to be constructed from materials that shouldn't have existed, according to established metallurgy principles, powered by energy sources that violated several basic assumptions about safe reactor design, and equipped with weapons systems that treated the laws of physics as polite suggestions rather than inviolable constants. The communication channels lit up with transmissions that maintained humanity's characteristic blend of friendliness and barely contained lethality. The human fleet commander, speaking with the sort of calm professionalism that marked genuinely dangerous individuals, extended greetings to their Krethak visitors, while simultaneously demonstrating weapons capabilities that could restructure local space-time if deployed with enthusiasm. The message managed to be simultaneously welcoming and terrifying, like being invited to dinner by beings who casually mentioned their expertise in exotic preparation techniques. The psychological warfare that followed represented a masterclass in species-specific intimidation that the Krethak military academies would study for generations, assuming any of them survived to establish those academies. The humans didn't threaten violence so much as demonstrate their comprehensive understanding of Krethak biology, technology and tactical preferences, with the sort of detailed precision that suggested extensive prior research. They knew things about Krethak physiology that most Krethak didn't know about themselves. The human vessels began broadcasting detailed technical specifications for weapons systems specifically designed to exploit Krethak biological vulnerability. The transmissions included helpful diagrams explaining how certain frequency combinations could disrupt Krethak neural functions, comprehensive chemical formulas for atmospheric compositions that would prove lethal to their respiratory systems, and engineering blueprints for kinetic weapons, optimized for penetrating chitinous armor at precisely the angles that would cause maximum structural damage. The fleet's medical officer, reviewing the biological warfare data with growing horror, realized that the humans had somehow conducted comprehensive physiological analysis of his species without any direct contact. The accuracy of their biological models exceeded the precision of Krethak medical databases, suggesting either remarkable analytical capabilities or access to information sources that should have been impossible for isolated primitives to obtain. The technological demonstration escalated when human vessels began displaying defensive capabilities that transformed space combat from military science into performance art. Their ships maneuvered through three-dimensional space with the sort of casual grace that suggested artificial gravity systems operating at efficiency levels that shouldn't have been achievable with known engineering approaches. Energy shields deflected test shots with minimal power expenditure while simultaneously analyzing the incoming projectiles and transmitting detailed critiques of Krethak weapons design philosophy. The humans appeared to treat warfare as an intellectual exercise, requiring creative problem-solving rather than simple application of superior firepower. Their tactical responses demonstrated strategic thinking that incorporated variables the Krethak hadn't considered, contingency planning that anticipated scenarios, their own military doctrine, classified as impossible, and resource management that suggested logistical capabilities, extending far beyond their apparent technological limitations. The psychological pressure intensified when human communications began referencing specific details about individual Krethak vessels, including crew complement data, personal histories of command staff, and maintenance records that should have been classified beyond any reasonable possibility of alien access. The humans knew the fleet commander's favorite recreational activities, the communications officer's educational background, and the tactical analyst's recent performance evaluations, with the sort of casual familiarity that suggested comprehensive surveillance capabilities operating on galactic scale.
The final escalation came when humanity revealed the extent of their strategic preparation for this encounter. The humans, speaking with the sort of patient enthusiasm typically reserved for explaining simple concepts to slow students, described their comprehensive contingency planning for potential alien contact scenarios. They had apparently anticipated Krethak arrival, prepared response protocols for various threat levels, and developed countermeasures specifically designed to address conquest attempts by chitinous species with superiority complexes. The surveillance data they presented painted a picture of galactic intelligence gathering that elevated humanity from isolated primitives to potential superpower status. They possessed detailed files on Krethak military doctrine, comprehensive analyses of their previous conquest campaigns, and strategic assessments of their technological capabilities that exceeded the accuracy of their own internal reports. The humans had been watching, learning, and preparing while maintaining the appearance of primitive isolation. The diplomatic revolution occurred when humanity extended an invitation that managed to be simultaneously generous and absolutely terrifying. They offered the Krethak Empire membership in what they described as the Galactic Community, a cooperative alliance of species dedicated to mutual advancement and peaceful coexistence. The proposal included detailed frameworks for cultural exchange, technological sharing and joint exploration initiatives that would benefit all participating civilizations. The underlying message was delivered with characteristic human subtlety. Cooperation would be rewarded with unprecedented opportunities for advancement, while continued aggression would be met with responses that made their defensive demonstration look like a casual warm-up exercise. The humans presented this choice with the sort of cheerful optimism that suggested they were equally prepared for either outcome and would approach both with the same enthusiastic competence. The Krethak fleet found itself in the unprecedented position of requesting permission to withdraw from what had begun as a routine conquest mission and somehow transformed into the most significant diplomatic crisis in their civilization's history. The humans granted this request with gracious understanding, providing safe passage coordinates and expressing hope for future meetings under more peaceful circumstances. The intelligence reports that eventually reached Krethak High Command painted a picture that fundamentally altered their understanding of galactic civilization. Earth wasn't an isolated primitive world waiting for enlightenment through conquest. It was the homeworld of apex predators who had achieved technological civilization while maintaining their evolutionary adaptations to one of the most hostile environments in known space, and who had apparently been monitoring galactic affairs with the patient interest of beings planning their eventual emergence onto the interstellar stage. The Universal Species Classification Index required comprehensive revision following the encounter, with humanity receiving a preliminary designation that broke several existing categorical frameworks. The humans had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded established parameters for multi-classification levels, while maintaining behavioral patterns that suggested either remarkable diplomatic sophistication or strategic patience that operated on timescales. The Krethak found conceptually challenging. The final irony that settled over the Krethak Empire like cosmic dust was elegantly simple. They had spent millennia establishing themselves as the galaxy's apex predators, only to discover that the actual apex predators had been quietly developing on a backwater world, preparing for the day when they would introduce themselves to their new neighbors with characteristic human enthusiasm for making friends and exploring interesting possibilities for mutually beneficial cooperation. The galaxy, it seemed, had new management,